Would really be honored to introduce Dr. King. John B. King Jr. is the president and CEO of the Education Trust and is the co-chair of the K-12 Climate Action Committee. From the beginning of his career as a high school social studies teacher and a middle school principal through his time served as the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education during the Obama administration and beyond, Dr. King has been a tireless advocate for educational innovation and access. It's an honor to have him joining us for this year's summit. And we welcome you, Dr. King, and thank you for making yourself available to us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you, Cindy.
Yeah.
My great-grandfather was enslaved on a property just about 25 miles from where I live in Silver Spring, Maryland. There's something quite powerful about standing in this cabin and realizing that my great-grandfather was enslaved here in Montgomery County, and then I had the opportunity to serve in the cabinet of the first African-American president and live just 25 miles away. Sitting on a house, What I want for my daughters is a life where they can pursue their dreams, a life where they can pass on to their kids a life of opportunity. Both my parents passed away when I was a kid. Home was really hard, lonely, scary, but school was amazing. I had a series of public school teachers who created this space where I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. Education saved my life. Schools are the foundation for our future health of our democracy, and it's our job to make sure as a state that we provide a great educational opportunity for every kid. We're starting a Strong Future in Maryland because we know we need to build a movement that works to ensure that we have a more equitable and just future, works to ensure an equitable economic recovery, ensure our long-term health and well-being on this planet. There are some people who say that because of COVID-19 and the economic crisis, we need to expect less of government, we need to hope for less for our society. But that's just plain wrong. Strong Future Maryland has the opportunity to create a movement of folks all across the state who believe in a stronger future.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Yes. Excellent. Can you see the slides? Yeah. All right. Excellent. Well, thank you for the opportunity to join all of you. Thank you, Cindy, for the great opening remarks and introduction. I'm certainly grateful to NOAA and the Chesapeake Bay program for this morning's conversation, but more importantly for the work that the Chesapeake Bay program is doing, which really I think of as a model for how collaboration across sectors, across agencies, across states can help to advance conservation and care for the environment. I want to talk this morning about the K-12 Climate Action Commission And so I'm going to put in the chat the link to the commission website, so you all have that. I'll begin with just a little context on why I care so deeply about this. Sometimes people say, well, you spent your life as an educator, you're Secretary of Education, why are you working on environmental issues? Well, of course, I've always been passionate about care for the environment, but it really deepened for me when I had my daughters. They're 14 and 17 now, but their enjoyment of the environment, our enjoyment of nature together as a family, whether it's hikes in state parks here in Maryland where I live, or my daughter spending time at summer camp on the Chesapeake, or going to Puerto Rico where my mother was born and exploring the environment there, hiking in the rainforest. Those opportunities, those experiences deepened my passion for environmental issues. But now I have also a tremendous sense of urgency, because we are already seeing the impact of climate change here in Maryland. This is not a tomorrow problem, it's a today problem. We are already losing farmland to saltwater intrusion on the Eastern Shore. We see flooding regularly in Howard County. We have some of the worst air quality in the country in Baltimore City. So this is, to me, an urgent issue for us to act on climate and also to act on environmental justice. Cindy described the disproportionate negative impact that climate change and pollution have on low-income communities, communities of color. And so I believe we have a moral responsibility to act. And I worry that in the education sector, despite really hard work that many on this call have done on environmental literacy and other environmental issues, we haven't fully mobilized the education sector to take action on climate and environmental justice. And that's really the spirit behind the K-12 Climate Action Commission. And when we think about the role the education sector can play, there's both infrastructure and instruction. I want to talk for a moment about infrastructure. We have more than 98,000 schools across the country. We've got more than 480,000 school buses, primarily diesel. We're serving more than 7 billion meals annually in schools. This is a huge infrastructure that could be redirected in ways that address climate action. We could be shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We could be rethinking composting so that we are dealing with our food waste differently. But we haven't done that yet at scale across the sector. That's part of the spirit behind the K-12 Climate Action Commission. But we also know that we could be doing more from an educational standpoint, from an instructional standpoint, in our science classes, in our social studies classes, helping students to prepare as citizens for grappling with the consequences of climate change. We also know that in schools, we're seeing the consequences of the kinds of environmental justice disparities that Cindy raised. Disproportionately, students of color and students from low-income backgrounds are living in communities and attending schools that are located near facilities that generate pollution. They are exposed to lead in the water. They're exposed to other pollutants, and it has a real educational consequence. You think about how asthma, and I saw this firsthand as a teacher and principal, how asthma drives students to miss school and then fall behind academically. That is a consequence of choices we are making around environmental policy. Or think about this, in Baltimore City last week, more than 30 schools had to close because they don't have adequate air conditioning. And that problem is going to get worse across the country as climate change continues. Now, as I say, we have this tremendous opportunity to mobilize the education sector, to mobilize educators, students, parents, and that's the spirit behind the commission. How do we mobilize the schools serving our 50 million students to unlock the power of the sector to be a force for climate action, climate solutions, and environmental justice? In the commission, we have put together a diverse group of individuals, including former governors, former members of Congress, leaders in civil rights, the environment, and of course the education sector, including the leaders of the NEA and the AFT. I co-chair the commission with Governor Chrissy Todd Whitman, the former New Jersey governor, who was also EPA administrator for President Bush. We also have some folks familiar to all of you on the commission, Governor Jack Markell from Delaware, former Pennsylvania Secretary of Education, Pedro Rivera. This diverse community of people has spent time over the last several months in listening sessions, learning from folks all across the country. We began, our first product was a state policy landscape report. And in that state policy landscape report, we looked at 3 areas. And you can find that on our website, which I put in the chat. We looked at what are schools around the country doing to reduce our carbon footprint. How are schools across the country leveraging solar, geothermal? How are schools across the country shifting to electric buses? How are folks approaching food preparation and disposal differently? We looked at policies around adaptation. How are schools responding to extreme weather events? As I say, my family spends time in Puerto Rico, where my mother was born. We think a lot about what folks in Puerto Rico have gone through in terms of severe disasters and how much school has been missed. So this question of resilience is critical. Certainly we've seen that as a country around COVID. We've really got to think about how do we make sure that students can continue learning and continue to have the supportive relationships at school, even as we deal with the growing consequences of climate change. And we've looked at across states at how states are approaching changes to their science standards. Think about New Jersey, that's committed to climate change education at every grade level, K through 12. We've looked at how states are changing social studies standards to help students think about the intersection between climate action and the health of our democracy. And we've looked at how schools are working on career and technical education to prepare young people for jobs in fields like renewable energy, like weatherization. That state policy landscape was our starting place. Then we've gone on to have these listening sessions with folks all across the country. You see there the topics of our various listening sessions. We heard a lot from students, student activists in Salt Lake City who went and persuaded their school board to adopt a clean energy resolution. We heard from a science teacher from St. Thomas who's worked with her elementary school students to develop a rain garden to better manage drainage so that they can reduce stormwater flooding. We heard from the director of the P-TECH schools in New York, a set of schools that are helping students graduate with a high school diploma, associate's degree, first in line for a job with employer partners. And they are in many cases working with employer partners who are working actively on climate action issues, environmental justice issues, but they're really trying to think about environmental sustainability across every one of their career and technical education programs. If you go on our website, K-12 Climate Action, you can actually watch some of those listening sessions and hear from really powerful students and educators sharing their stories. I want to quickly share one of those stories. This is a video clip of a student, Maya Greene, who graduated just last year from Charleston County School of the Arts in North Charleston, South Carolina. She's now a student activist on environmental justice issues as a freshman at Stanford. And this is an exchange between her and Becky Pringle, who's the national president of the NEA. Make sure you can hear the sound well. Hold on 1 second. All right, you can see the video, right? All right.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how you could envision this work, from the beginning, because being centered in racial and social justice, because too often at the end we think about that impact, but how would you envision centering the work from the beginning in racial justice?
I think in terms of how that looks in the classroom, they're absolutely related because
Sorry about that.
Can you talk to me about being centered in racial and social justice? Because too often at the end we think about that impact, but how would you envision centering the work from the beginning in racial justice?
I think in terms of how that looks in the classroom, they're absolutely related because my background where I, was able to embark on this kind of self-directed journey my senior year to like really investigate my family's heritage and what race means, and especially in the historical context of growing up in Charleston, South Carolina. That really illustrated to me the importance of culturally relevant education. And I think that culturally relevant education often looks like the project-based learning that Nicole spoke of, or the service learning that I spoke of, and that when you are really guiding students on kind of figuring out where they fit in climate action and figuring out where their lived experiences, students are always asking why. So, maybe, starting with their lived experience and letting them investigate that and letting them investigate the way their identity colors their perception of that and how that intersects with like the larger global issue of climate. I think students will make the connections if the space is given for them to make the connections, and they're really encouraged to value their story and bring their identities and their experiences and their heritage and the school educates the whole person. And if that is encouraged in the classroom, then racial equity and climate action absolutely will go hand in hand.
Just to share a couple of reflections on what we've learned through these listening sessions. Certainly what we see is that the education sector can have a tremendous impact on climate action and climate justice if we provide the right supports and the right state policy framework. And we'll prepare at the end of the commission process a report that will call on states, school districts, and the federal government to take action on climate issues through the K-12 sector. This is cross-sector work. This is intergenerational work. This is work where we ought to elevate student voice. Our experience in listening sessions was that students have phenomenal insights about what we need to do, and they are often incredible organizers and able to persuade school boards, school superintendents, state policymakers to take action. A worry that I have as we come out of these listening sessions is that despite improved rhetorical efforts, we haven't necessarily seen the action we need from policymakers at the federal and state level in terms of real resources invested in K-12 climate action. Whether we're looking at the congressional debates about the infrastructure bill, if climate isn't in those infrastructure bills that come out of Congress, that will be a huge failure. But looking even within the bills, we ought to see K-12 climate action reflected. We ought to see an investment in school infrastructure that is green infrastructure. And if that's missing, that will be a huge missed opportunity on the part of the federal government. Similarly, at the state level, we ought to see states doing much more to incentivize schools to move to renewable energy, to geothermal, to replace their bus fleets with electric buses. And we see nascent efforts, but not the level of urgency that we desperately need. And this is why I launched Strong Future Maryland that you saw described in the video. I think this needs to be a New Deal moment for our country, that we have to come out of COVID not saying, how do we get back to how things were in February of 2020, but actually ask, how do we build a more just, more equitable, more sustainable future? That's the spirit behind Strong Future Maryland. And that's the spirit as well behind the K-12 Climate Action Commission, looking ahead to how we build a stronger, healthier society. So let me close with this. As you enter these conversations over the next day, I want to encourage you to think about 4 questions that, as a former high school social studies teacher, I think, and as the parent of a 14 and 17-year-old, I think are very central to our work in K-12. One of the questions we have to ask on behalf of our students is, what must I know? What's the knowledge? What are the skills that we need to make sure that our students have, not only to navigate issues of climate action, but issues of environmental justice? What do they have to understand about our history, for example, of systemic racism as a society, in order to enter these conversations about environmental justice? A second question that all students are asking themselves: where do I fit? And you heard that in Maya's comments. The desire that students have to see where they fit, to make a connection between abstract ideas and their immediate experience in school, in the community, the environment in which they live. And we saw that powerfully in our listening sessions, that student passion for these issues was really unlocked when they got to see how climate change is affecting their immediate community, when they got to see how environmental justice issues play out in their home community. A third question: how can I make a difference on my own? We worry that sometimes young people feel disempowered by the conversation about climate. It can feel overwhelming to think about how existential the threat is. And so we've got to make sure that students come away understanding what difference can they make as individuals, but then most importantly, and this is a question for our students, for our parents, for our school communities, and for all of us: how can we make a difference together? Climate action and environmental justice are collective action problems. They cannot be solved only by individual action. They require all of us working together. And we have to help students understand that and envision how they will collaborate with their peers, with their communities, to advance climate action and environmental justice. So with that, thanks for the opportunity to share with you about K-12 climate action. I hope you'll check out the website and some of the listening sessions, follow our work, and I wish you the best for the rest of the conference. Thanks again for the opportunity to join you.
Well, wonderful. I think that was your dog giving you the standing ovation that you deserve, because that was just a wonderful opening for our summit. We certainly, throughout the course of this conversation, will be talking about how do we use the funding